Hi everyone, and welcome to this lecture on our nutrients. So we're going to look at six primary nutrient categories: carbohydrates, lipids, which is our fats group, proteins, vitamins, minerals, and water. And then phytochemicals is not necessarily considered its own nutrient category at this point. Although it's sort of becoming one, but a lot of times phytochemicals kind of get lumped into the vitamin or mineral category. But effectively, they are different plant nutrients that we know are beneficial and useful to the plant for survival and health. And we're learning that a lot of these phytochemicals, meaning plant chemicals, are also really important and critical to overall human health too. So I'll refer to phytochemicals at least a couple times in the following slides. So let's go through and look at each one of these individually. One further classification we'll do before we get into each of the different categories. We can classify these nutrients as macronutrients and as micronutrients. So macronutrients include the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the lipids. All three of these can be a source of energy to the human body, and the unit of energy that we talk about when we talk about energy in our food or energy that the body uses or produces is a calorie. So calorie is just the unit of energy found in our foods, and those calories are housed in the molecules carbohydrate, lipid, and protein. We do not find calories in vitamins, minerals, water, and other phytochemicals, phytonutrients, for example. Macronutrients are larger molecules when compared to our micronutrients, so they just are bigger, they take up more space, and we also require them in larger amounts. So we usually talk about the recommended amount in terms of grams per day for carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. In addition to being a source of energy, we can say that these macronutrients also have structural and functional roles. So some examples of structural roles is that these molecules literally make up the plasma membrane, like the phospholipid bilayer, which is the membrane around every cell in our body. They make up cellular and tissue structure, like our muscles, and also the fascia that surrounds our muscles, and that's like just superficial to our skin. And they also play functional roles. So in particular, lipids and proteins become hormones in the body. They're enzymes that help reactions to occur. They become really important molecules in digestion. Again, they make up cells and tissue. And they can also function as transport molecules in the blood, and also from outside of a cell to inside of a cell, so across the cell membrane. Micronutrients are a little bit different. Micronutrients include vitamins and minerals. Relative to the macronutrients, micronutrients are smaller molecules, or they're single elements like minerals, and they are required in smaller amounts by the body. When we talk about the recommended dietary allowance of micronutrients, we talk in terms of micrograms and milligrams per day rather than grams per day. In terms of the functionality of micronutrients, they are just essential for normal and healthy body functioning as well as growth and development. So some examples might include energy production pathways, the immune system, blood clotting, bone health, fluid balance. We'll see some more examples later on. We have water. Water doesn't really get classified as a macronutrient or a micronutrient, although you could arguably throw it into either category, but it's kind of its own standalone nutrient. So all cells in the body do require water for proper functioning, and some of the reasons for why is because water helps to regulate our body temperature. Water is also protective, kind of surrounding tissues, our spine, and our joints. Water also makes up the fluid portion of our blood. All cells, like inside of the cell membrane, have a liquid portion, the cytosol, which is also water-based. We can excrete waste products through the sweat and through our sweat and urine, which is again water-based. Also, our saliva and the fluid in our eyes is also water-based. So again, also aiding in the first immune response, or the first immune barrier, being those mucous membranes. And then water is also really critical for healthy bowel function as well as stool formation. We do lose water on a daily basis just through respiration, just through breathing. We do lose water. And then, of course, every time we urinate and when we sweat, even just little bits of sweat, like if we're not going for some hardcore exercise, but if we just have a little bit of, perspiration in our armpits, or some people behind the knees, if it's a particularly hot environment, and of course on our face, or even just on our hands and arms. So we always sweat a little bit, even if we think we don't. And water is lost through our sweat. So water is really critical and must be replenished every day. And then, of course, in addition to drinking water, we do also get about 20% of our water requirement from fruits and vegetables, if we eat enough fruits and vegetables. So now we can go through each one of these in a bit more detail. So we'll start with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are sugars and starches and fiber. And we find carbohydrates in fruits, grains, vegetables, beans and lentils, and milk. We can more or less classify carbohydrates as complex carbohydrates and as as complex carbohydrates and as simple sugars. So complex carbohydrates include starches and fibers. These are really long molecules, very complex molecules. I'll show you an image on the next slide. Complex carbohydrates can contain basically hundreds, if not thousands, of individual glucose molecules or sugar molecules bound together. And often there's some branching, so it's not just one continuous chain, but it's a primary chain, and then there might be, dozens of side branches going off. And the chain and the branches are all just glucose molecules linked together. So anytime we're talking about carbohydrate, we're also talking about glucose, and the more colloquial name for glucose is sugar. So those are starches, are those long branched chains. Fibers are also long chains, but rather than being branched, fibers are often a little more brick-like. So you might have like a primary chain, but rather than having branching, you might have several chains that are sort of layered on top of each other and bound to each other, both vertically and horizontally. So fiber is also just chains of glucose molecules, but bound together generally a little bit more tightly than starches. Starch we can digest, humans can digest, and that's where we get most of our glucose from. Fibers we cannot digest. So fibers do one of two things. If it's a soluble fiber, it can actually be digested by some of the symbiotic bacteria that naturally inhabit our large intestine. And when that happens, this is the whole probiotic-prebiotic conversation, but we won't really get into detail in this course. But the soluble fiber acts as prebiotic because it's food for the bacteria, and the bacteria are what we call probiotics, just bacteria. So the bacteria can feed on or ferment soluble fibers, and when they do that, often they're giving off short chain, actually fatty acid molecules that we then assimilate into our bodies, and we can use as an energy source. We use often as precursors to our immune system and to our immune response. So we have a very positive relationship with the bacteria that do ferment soluble fibers in our gut. So we won't digest soluble fibers, but good bacteria will. And then insoluble fibers, we also don't digest, nor do the bacteria. So these act more like, I like to think about the broom analogy, and they just sort of sweep the stool out of our bowels. So when you get that urge to go to the bathroom, to go number two, it's usually the action of insoluble fibers working in your large intestine to say, oh, okay, here we go, time to clean out, time to empty out. Another aspect of the soluble fiber is that they are soluble, meaning they're water soluble. So they do absorb water, again, in the colon. And that also helps, we say, to bulk our stool. So basically to form our stool into, semi-solid lumps that can then come out more easily. So both soluble and insoluble fibers are very critical to proper bowel function. So we should be passing a bowel movement every day, if not a couple times a day or even 3 times a day. So anyone who's not doing that may want to add some more fiber to their diet. Starches and fibers are found exclusively in plant foods, so vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, and lentils. Simple sugar, it has a lot of names. So sugar, it could be called. We've mentioned glucose, and then there's also fructose and lactose are 2 of our other individual sugar molecules that naturally exist in our food supply. So fructose we find pretty exclusively in fruits, lactose we find exclusively in milk, and glucose we find pretty much in all of the food that we eat except for animal flesh. Simple sugars are just these individual sugar molecules. So individually, a glucose molecule, a fructose molecule, or a lactose molecule. Or it could be 2 of these molecules bound to each other. So it could be a glucose bound to a glucose. It could be a fructose bound to a glucose, which is what we call sucrose. Or it could be glucose bound to lactose, which is what we call galactose, which is, again, only found in milk. So we do find some simple sugars naturally occurring, like we said, fruit, milk, and honey also is where we find the sucrose, glucose bound to fructose. An important distinction on fruits is that fruits also contain complex carbohydrates and fruits which in the form of fiber. And fruits also contain a lot of water, and fruits also contain vitamins and minerals, which we'll see later on are as well very critical to good human health. Milk is a critical nutrient for babies. So milk is generally really fat rich. It's usually about 50% fat as it comes out of the breast. And that's important because a baby is developing both, importantly, the brain, especially during the first 6 months to 2 years of life, and of course throughout the lifetime, but really building that brain, and then also building a body. So fat is really critical for new cell production, new cell growth. There is no biological need for milk beyond roughly 2 years of age. Historically, all humans really stopped producing lactase, which is the enzyme to digest lactose, which is milk sugar. And still, roughly about 2/3 of the entire human population does not produce lactase. And that's where we get the term lactose intolerant, is when someone does not produce lactase. And really that's the normal, it's normal to not produce lactase anymore after about 2 years old because naturally we don't require milk anymore. So the folks who manage to maintain lactase production are actually the anomaly. So milk really not an essential food after about 2 years old. In addition to these naturally occurring simple sugars, we have artificially occurring sugars, and you'll also see the name added sugar. And you saw that briefly on the food label if you looked at the reading from last week, the nutrition facts panel. So added sugars, any of these isolated sugars that have been added into a food. We find that most processed foods have some amount of added sugar. So cereals, breads, crackers, chips, tortillas, cookies, bars, cakes, muffins, all pastries, any baked good. Even certain types of meat, certain sausages, deli meats, and then definitely a lot of our beverages, of course, sodas. And this can be, don't let the artificial word mislead you. These added sugars can be natural sugars like glucose or fructose or sucrose. I'm saying that they're artificially occurring in the food. They're artificially added. So it could be natural sugars or it could be artificial sugars that are sweetening some of these processed foods. But again, if we draw a comparison from fruits to any of these processed foods, the major difference is some of what I mentioned a moment ago. So fruits are very rich also in fiber, very rich in water, very rich in abundant in numerous vitamins and minerals. Whereas most cereals, breads, crackers, cookies, pastries, bars, meal replacement bars, sausages, deli meats, beverages, we can't say that they're also good sources of fiber. Most of them are not. We can't say that any of them are good sources of water because they're not. And variable that they might be sources of vitamins or minerals, and if they are, they've also been artificially added into that food. And then many of these foods might also contain some what we call nutrients of concern, like trans fats, cholesterol, excess sodium, and saturated fats, and we'll learn more about those in the following slides. Okay, so here's the image, the sort of pictographic of your starch, your glycogen, and your cellulose. Each of these little hexagon shapes is your glucose molecule. So again, any one of these little things is a glucose molecule. So amylose and amylopectin are your two examples of starches. There are other types of starch, but these are the two most common, and you'll see the branching. So here's your primary chain with some branching. Amylose doesn't really have as much branching as amylopectin. Glycogen is how we store glucose in our muscle and our liver. So as we consume carbohydrate foods, depending on the time of day, we tend to do more glycogen storage in the morning and the middle of the day. So we might eat these foods, break off each one of these glucose molecules, and then send those molecules to our muscles and to our liver, and then actually build this glycogen molecule, which is effectively our storage form of glucose. And then as we go throughout the day and have energy requirements to do our normal activities, we will begin to break down the glycogen. And also during the nighttime, we'll break glycogen down as an energy source. The brain uses glucose almost exclusively, pretty much exclusively, as its energy source. So that's part of why we have glycogen storage in the liver, is in particular to help supply the brain. And then cellulose is an example of a fiber. It's one type of fiber. There are many different types of fibers. And this is how you can kind of see here both the vertical and the horizontal binding. So they're bound this way and they're bound this way. And again, it's just a conglomeration of glucose molecules. But because of this intense binding and kind of the brick-like structure, we don't have actually the enzymes. Humans don't produce the enzymes to break some of the bond orientations of fiber. So that's why we can't digest that. But some certain bacteria do have the adequate enzyme capacity to break these bonds. Whereas this type of bond, we do have the capacity to break down the bonds that are found in starches and of course the bonds that are found in glycogen. A little more on carbohydrate, kind of some functionality things. So carbohydrate is the body's primary source of energy, and that's pretty much the job of carbohydrate. That's really about it. As I said previously, it is the exclusive source of energy for the brain. And then it's worth having a short discussion on the difference between how complex carbohydrates act in the body, I guess, how we respond to them, compared to how we respond to simple sugars. So complex carbohydrates, being those starches and fibers to an extent, they slow our digestion way down. So fiber in particular slows our digestion down because we can't do anything with it. So it's just sort of like they're taking up space, making it more difficult for our digestive enzymes and digestive acids and digestive chemicals to work on our food. So by having fiber present, it just naturally slows the rate of digestion, and slower is better, generally speaking. Again, all carbohydrate is providing energy to our bodies. So if we have slower digestion, We also then necessarily have a slower release of glucose into our bloodstream, meaning we have a longer lasting energy supply. As we talked about on a couple slides ago, fiber is also really important for regular bowel movements, and it also helps to support a good, healthy gut microbiome. Microbiome being the term referring to all of the organisms that inhabit our gut. So the different bacteria, the different yeasts, the different fungi that are all naturally there. So by having adequate soluble fiber in our diet, we can kind of ensure that we're feeding those symbiotic bacteria that we want, and helping them stay well colonized and well populated in our gut. And then, like we saw, when we take in complex carbohydrates, we are also helping to contribute to our glycogen production, which is our storage source of glucose. Simple sugars, on the other hand, I didn't show you an image of the simple sugars, but it would basically be just a pile of those little hexagon shapes not bound to each other because they're just individual molecules. So we don't have to do any digestive work because they're not even bound to each other. So we can just start readily absorbing those individual glucose molecules actually right out of the mouth. But then, of course, once we swallow, get through the stomach, we do absorb them as well out of the small intestine. So simple sugars provide what we consider to be an immediate source of energy because the digestion is so rapid, it's so quick. So again, we're not even really hardly doing any digestion. The sugars are just basically readily available to us. The complication here is that when we consume simple sugars, particularly from processed foods that don't have fiber as a buffer, like remember, fiber slows things down. I should put fiber here too. When we consume those processed foods that don't have fiber to slow digestion, and they have simple sugars in them, we just get this rapid release of glucose into the bloodstream, which can lead to rapid blood sugar spikes and then subsequent similarly rapid blood sugar crashes. So if we do that once in a blue moon, not a big deal. We can totally recover from that. It doesn't feel good, but it's not going to be a problem if it's kind of a one-off occurrence. However, if we are eating foods that have added sugars, refined carbohydrates, with no fiber, no water, then if we're doing that routinely, like meal after meal, day after day, week after week, year after year, that sort of routine consumption of these added sugars. And again, notice I'm saying added, not naturally occurring. So I'm not talking about fruits here. I'm really just talking about the processed foods that I'd listed on the previous slide. That routine long-term consumption of added sugar foods definitely increases the risk for, if not as a causative factor, for diabetes and certainly other health complications, perhaps the most obvious of them being also cardiovascular diseases, so that the oxidation of the plaque that can build up in our arteries can often be caught, and the oxidation is what leads to rupture and then stroke or heart attack, can often be triggered by excess elevated blood sugar levels. Without a break. So again, it's that routine long-term consumption, not just a one-off event. All right, let's talk about lipids. So maybe more information than you want to know, but worth kind of having a full overview. So lipids is the term given to this class of molecules that includes phospholipids, sterols, and triglycerides. Triglycerides are composed of fat molecules, and those fat molecules may be either fatty or oily. Fatty, they're usually more solid at room temperature. Oily, they're usually more liquid at room temperature. Our bodies can make most of these molecules as needed. There's really very little need for fat in the diet, except for, again, a pregnant or a lactating woman, and then an infant, a newborn and an infant. And of course, anyone who might be recovering from severe weight loss, perhaps due to disease or injury or surgery or something, then there would also be an increased fat need in the body. So phospholipids, these are molecules that have both a hydrophilic, meaning water-loving, and a hydrophobic, meaning water-repelling component to the molecule. So these molecules make good, they're very useful in parts of the body where we need both a fat, something that can kind of interact with fats and something that can interact with water. So we see phospholipids in the phospholipid bilayer, which is the plasma membrane around all of our cells. And most of our body is water-based. So by having this phospholipid bilayer, we basically keep, that's how we keep cell material inside of the cells and extracellular material outside of the cells. So it creates a fatty barrier, basically. Phospholipids are also transport molecules, particularly in the blood, but again, also across the phospholipid bilayer, in particular for fat-soluble vitamins and other fat-soluble phytochemicals. The blood is water-based, so we would want to have a water-loving component that could bind and float in the blood plasma, and then we would need to have that fat-loving component to actually carry the fat-soluble molecule. And then bile, which is a digestive component. Bile is how we start to digest and emulsify fats. So again, because our digestive organs are water-based, we need to have something that can be both water and fat interactive. Sterols are a second class of lipids. Sterols make up many of our functional molecules in the body. So sterols make up hormones. A lot of our hormones are sterol-based. We also see sterols in the plasma membrane, so they help maintain fluidity and permeability of the plasma membrane. And then sterols are also the precursors to not just hormones, but also to some of our nutrients, in particular vitamin D. Vitamin D is built from a sterol molecule. Sterols, we do make basically most of the sterols, if not all the sterols that we need. Sterols are also naturally occurring in plants, and then cholesterols are naturally occurring in animals. So vitamin D, for example, is a cholesterol molecule, and a cholesterol is a type of sterol. And also a lot of our reproductive hormones are actually cholesterols. So we also do not have a need for cholesterol in the diet because we make all that we need. And then we have triglycerides. Triglycerides can further be classified as saturated, which is where we have the kind of the term fat, and also unsaturated, where we get the term oils. Triglycerides are a source of energy to us, and we can also, when we build fat tissue on our bodies, we call that adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is stored fat, and it's stored in the form of triglyceride. And then again, all the foods that we eat do contain different combinations of these lipids, and basically usually contain all of these lipids and different types of triglycerides, but we tend to classify foods based on the type of triglyceride that's most abundant. So let's take a look at different triglycerides. Again, we'll kind of simplify this here and talk about saturated and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats, just meaning simply that in the fatty acid, all of the carbons, the fatty acid chain is just a chain of carbon molecules bound to each other. And so when it's saturated, it means that all the carbons are just bound with a single bond to one another, and that they're saturated with all of the hydrogen atoms that they can have. Kind of goes back to basic chemistry. I'll show you a picture on the next slide. Saturated fats we find primarily in our animal foods. So beef, pork, lamb, dark chicken, meat, and poultry skin. Full-fat dairy foods, and also high-fat dairy foods like heavy cream, whipping cream, butter, sour cream, ice cream. Lard, of course, which is just the fatty portion of pork, or tallow, which would be the fatty portion of beef, or rendered fat, excuse me. And then we do also find some saturated fats in coconut oil and palm oil. Up top, I had said that there are at least 10 different types of saturated fats common in the foods that we eat. So interestingly to note that the types of saturated fat occurring in coconut oil and palm oil are not the same types of saturated fats occurring in beef, pork, lamb, chicken, and other animals. So generally, plants are rich in different types of saturated fats than animals are. And then we have our unsaturated fats, which is what we call our oils. Again, several different types of unsaturated fats. We're not going to list them in this course just for simplification purposes, but you can pretty easily look it up on Google. So unsaturated fats we can also further classify as monounsaturated or polyunsaturated. And again, the term just has to do with the bonding of the carbon molecules. So monounsaturated means that there's one double bond in the fatty acid chain, and that double bond causes a little bit of a bend or a kink. Polyunsaturated in the chain, so it's not a linear chain anymore. Polyunsaturated meaning there are many or several double bonds in the fatty acid chain, and by having many kinks, you wind up having a very sort of fluid chain, kind of a wavy chain, which is what imparts the oily or the liquidy nature to foods that are rich in polyunsaturated fats. Again, we have very little biological need for fat overall. There are two types of fats that we've identified so far that we know we do have a strong biological need for. So we have omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids. Both of these classes are considered, or both of these molecules are considered essential to our diet, meaning it's essential that we do consume them from our food because we cannot make them. Most other saturated fats we can, and monounsaturated fats, and even some types of polyunsaturated fats we can make, but these two in particular we cannot make. So omega-3s we find in soybeans, walnuts, flax seeds, and a select few fish. So salmon is very popular. I didn't put it here because it's very popular. So some other ideas being herring, mackerel, and sardines. And again, that's a short list. There are actually lots of fish that are rich in omega-3s. And then omega-6s, which we find in corn, soybeans again, and safflower oils. And then omega-9 is just another example of a polyunsaturated fat. Not essential because we can make it. We can make omega-9s, but we do find a lot of omega-9s in nuts and seeds. So here's just the schematic of a saturated fat, kind of like the chemical structure of a saturated fat versus an unsaturated. So you'll see these are called fatty acid chains. And you'll see it has just a carbon backbone, and you'll see all of the bonds between each carbon are just a single bond. And what that means then is that it leaves basically two binding sites for all of the carbons in the middle of the chain to bind hydrogen. So this is saturated with hydrogen molecules. That's where the term saturated comes from. And then unsaturated, meaning that it's no longer saturated with as many hydrogen molecules as possible. And the reason for that is because now these two carbons have decided to share 2 electrons with each other instead of just one, resulting in a double bond. And again, just because of kind of the orientation of these individual atoms as they bind to each other, this double bond causes a kink in the chain, which is what imparts, again, kind of the fluid or the liquid or the oily nature of unsaturated fats. A little more on, we haven't even talked about triglycerides. So triglycerides are a source of energy to the body, but they are second to glucose. So the body is generally using glucose as its energy substrate, and then there are certain times where we might also be using fatty acids, triglycerides, the fatty acid component of the triglyceride, or sometimes we're using both glucose and fatty acids. Fats are the most calorie dense of our 3 macronutrients, meaning per gram they contain the most calories. So carbohydrates and proteins contain 4 calories per gram each, whereas fats contain 9 calories per gram. So they're just very dense molecules. and thereby containing a lot of calories. Which is part of why we don't eat too many of them, because then we wind up taking in too many calories overall. We can also store triglycerides. Again, we store triglycerides in our adipose tissue, so triglycerides can be a storage source of energy, but then also has some other pretty important roles. So our fat tissue does also provide insulation and like protection, kind of support and padding basically, because our bones are obviously very hard. So if we didn't have some padding around our bones, it would hurt. Like if you ever whack some of your bonier parts of your body on something, like you accidentally hit the wall or the desk or whatever, if you catch your elbow or you catch a joint, there's not a lot of fat around those joints always, especially the external part of it. And so you know that it hurts a lot, or if you catch a part of your bone, it hurts. So anyway, fat can be protective, and we do have a little bit of fat that helps to line our digestive organs, just a very small amount, but that can also, our digestive and our vital organs. So also for protection. And then again, transportation, we saw that with the phospholipids and sensory qualities in our food too. So a lot of the molecules that impart flavor and smell are fat binding. So if we have food that's cooked without fat, we tend to lose some of those flavor and odor components. You don't need a lot of fat to get the smell and the tastes, and again, fat is naturally occurring in most of our food, so we don't really need to add additional fat. And then texture too. Fat adds a nice texture to a lot of our foods, but again, fat is naturally occurring in a lot of our foods, so there's not really a need to add extra. All right, and we'll talk briefly about trans fats and hydrogenated fats. So remembering back to the saturated and unsaturated image, those unsaturated fats are kinked and so therefore more liquidy in nature. Hydrogenation is the process of converting that kink, basically straightening out the kink by changing the orientation of that double bond. So the double bonds, when it makes that kink, we call that cis. And if you recall the way the chain kinked, the two ends kind of went down to the same side. So that's cis, meaning same. Trans means opposite or different. And so in the trans shape, we would twist one end upward so that the chain would actually be straight. So cis is same, trans is opposite. This is a commercial process. We do have there's very few trans fats that do occur naturally in meats and dairy, but in very trace amounts, almost negligible. So really the primary trans fats in our diet come from processed foods, where food manufacturers wanted to include like a vegetable oil that might be rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids, but they wanted to make it more solid in nature. So they hydrogenated it to change the orientation from cis to trans of the double bond. This largely came about for purposes of shelf stability and decreasing rancidity, and definitely also came out of that craze where certain health experts had determined that butter and dairy products were no longer healthy because of the saturated fat content. So largely this process of hydrogenating oils came about in that era of margarine, but now we've realized that trans fats are even worse for us than saturated fats, although both should be minimized in the diet. Okay, protein. So protein is found in virtually throughout our body. All cells and a lot of the organelles inside of our cells are made of proteins. Our muscle tissue is definitely protein, our bones, our skin, our hair. But basically, our body is a protein structure. Proteins are very, very large, very complex molecules, and they are all very specific and very unique. So, like, there's too many proteins to name. What we can name are usually about 22 to 26 different amino acids. We know that there are definitely 22 that the body either makes or uses on a routine basis. So we'll go with 22 for now, but we have identified up to 26 amino acids in nature so far. So we use the amino acids as building blocks to build different protein molecules. And it's literally just the sequencing of the amino acids and then the sort of folding and twisting of that amino acid chain that determines what protein it is, what protein we've just made. For example, we don't, if you're working on your bicep curls or you're trying to build bicep muscles, you want to be building more muscle fiber proteins. You don't want to be building new liver enzymes in your bicep, right? So that's a very basic example of sort of the specificity of proteins. So I'll show you an image to hopefully give a little clarification to protein building. Most of those 22 amino acids we can make ourselves, but there are 9 that we cannot make, and we call those essential amino acids, and they must come from our food, just like the essential fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6. We'll talk more about this next week, but the source of the protein is really important to consider for human health and also for environmental health. And lastly, I didn't put it on this slide, but it should be said, earlier I categorized protein in the macronutrients, and well, it's not just me, it's classified as a macronutrient, which means is classified as something that provides energy to the body. But protein is very unique among the macronutrients in that being an energy source is really not its primary role. It can be a source of energy in a few circumstances. One, if we're not consuming if we only consumed protein, then we could break amino acids down into glucose or into fatty acids. There are 2 further classifications of amino acids. We have glucogenic amino acids and ketogenic amino acids. So all 22 of our amino acids can either be broken down into glucose, sorry, not broken down, but converted into glucose or converted into fatty acid. So if we have more amino acids than we need, we don't store amino acids the same way we store triglyceride and the same way we store glucose. If we have more amino acids than we need, if it's glucogenic, we'll convert it to glucose. And if we don't have a need for glucose, we might deposit it in glycogen. And if we don't have a need for glycogen at the time, we'll convert the glucose into fatty acid and store it in adipose. Similarly, if we're taking in more amino acid than we need, and it's ketogenic, we'll convert it to fatty acid and we'll deposit it into our adipose tissue. So if we're not consuming any carbohydrate or any fat, which I don't recommend, if you only consumed protein, you would ultimately break the glucogenic amino acids to glucose and use that for energy, and you would eventually break the ketogenic to fatty acids and use that for energy. Another place where we see protein being a source of energy is in starvation. So if we have not consumed any food for weeks, we've definitely gone through all of our glycogen stores, and we've probably started to go through the majority of our fat stores. So we will begin to break down our body tissue to access the proteins and break those down into amino acids and use those as an energy substrate. So I don't even include it on the slide because we really don't think of protein as an energy substrate except in starvation. Here is the, again, infographic of the protein structure. So we don't really need to retain this, but there's a primary structure, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. And it's in the quaternary structure that the protein becomes a complete molecule and is capable of doing its job, whether it's an enzyme, whether it's a hormone, whether it's a muscle protein, muscle fiber, whether it's a transport molecule. And you'll see the primary structure, we're starting to bind a chain of amino acids. In the secondary structure, we get some twisting tertiary structure, we get some folding and bending, and then in the quaternary structure, we're binding 2 or more of these polypeptide chains to form the actual functional structure of the protein. Again, we'll talk more on this next week, but it's worth taking a quick look at what can be called the package in which, like the food package in which protein is delivered. So protein-rich foods perhaps obviously include animal flesh, meats, dairy foods, eggs, and also most of our other food too, definitely beans and lentils, and whole grains, and then some of our vegetables, and nuts and seeds as well. So it's important for overall health to consider what else is in the food that's supplying the protein. So we can look through this kind of quickly, but in a steak, for example, 4 ounces, you'll get 33 grams of protein. You're going to get some saturated fat. You'll get some monounsaturated, some polyunsaturated, no omega-3, no fiber, and you'll get 66 milligrams of sodium. In the salmon, 4 ounces, slightly less protein, but still quite a bit. Very little saturated fat, some monounsaturated, some polyunsaturated, no fiber, pretty high sodium. Chicken, 4 ounces, still pretty high protein. And this is thigh, no skin. 2.7 grams of saturated fat, some monounsaturated, some polyunsaturated, no fiber, 120 milligrams of sodium. A 4-ounce ham, 22 in the protein, 1.6 on the saturated fat, no fiber, 1,439 milligrams of sodium. Lentils, 1 cup, 18 grams of protein, almost negligible saturated fat, 0.1. Some, again, kind of negligible monounsaturated, very little, almost negligible polyunsaturated, 15 grams of fiber, and only 4 milligrams of sodium. And again, you can look at the same for milk, and you can look at the same for almonds. So saturated fat is one of our nutrients of concern, something to be limited. Sodium is one of our nutrients of concern, something to be limited. And fiber is one of our nutrients to be basically maximizing. So it's interesting to kind of go down this list and see which foods are highest in saturated fat, highest in sodium, and find that they are all devoid of fiber. And then to look at the foods that are richest in fiber and compare their saturated fat and sodium content. And then we can also consider the protein package in terms of environmental health. So obviously all the food that we consume grows, whether it's a plant or an animal. And we can think about sort of the off-gassing of the food that we produce, like what do those plants give off into the environment? What do those animals give off into the environment? And in particular, we can look at greenhouse gas emissions, which we know to be one of the leading contributors to climate change. So if we look at some of the protein sources and common protein sources in our food, again, we'll see some plant sources and some meat sources. And this chart is looking at how these different food sources contribute to greenhouse gas production. So the highest contributors are beef, lamb, and goat. And it's interesting down here, it notes that the lighter shade is emission from the ag production itself, and then the darker shade is emissions from land use change. So we know that cows give off methane gas, like when they fart naturally, when they're digesting, they're giving off methane gas, which is contributing to the greenhouse gas production. But then also what we see in beef production, as well as for lamb and goat, we see basically deforestation. So large tracts of forest, rainforests, are torn down so that grain can be grown to feed these animals. And what happens is trees are major carbon sinks. So they actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and use it to grow into a tree. So when we cut trees down and burn them, we're releasing a ton of carbon into the atmosphere, and then just growing grasses and grains to feed these animals. So beef, lamb, and goat, major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And the next group would be poultries, pork, and dairy cows. And then you'll see eggs follow behind pretty closely, nuts pretty close behind eggs, soybeans kind of behind that, but all of these pretty much significantly less than the beef, lamb, and goat. And then up here we have fish, rice, beans, chickpeas, and lentils, corn and wheat, which are two grain foods, which are also relatively high in protein as far as grain foods go. So very interesting comparison in terms of total greenhouse gas emissions and contribution of our different protein foods to environmental changes. So kind of considering again the protein package, the total package of the food, and the total package of how the food even comes to your plate, considering that in the context of your own health and also the health of our environment at large. In this class, we won't get too deep into vitamins and minerals. So this is really all that I have for vitamins. Vitamins include both fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. Fat-soluble, we have vitamins A, D, E, and K. We find most of those in our fruits, vegetables, and nuts. And vitamin D we manufacture in our skin from cholesterol that we make ourselves upon exposure to sunlight. And then we have water-soluble vitamins, which is the whole B family, B1, 2, 3, B5, B6, B8, B9, B12. Grains are a really rich source of our B vitamins as well as meats because they tend animals because they tend to eat grains, and then vitamin C, which we find pretty exclusively in fruits and vegetables. So really myriad functions that these different vitamins play in the body. How our eyes work, cell differentiation, which is also growth, our immune system, our bone health, our bone density, bone turnover, growth, I guess, protection of cell membranes from antioxidant destruction, so functioning as antioxidants, clotting blood, energy metabolism, like deriving energy from our macronutrients, DNA synthesis and cell division, so again, more growth and repair. Vitamins and minerals are not an energy source to the body, really worth remembering that. Relative to our macronutrients, vitamins are just required in smaller amounts. Remember, we talk generally about milligrams and micrograms when we're talking about daily vitamin needs. And also vitamins are compounds. They're molecules, meaning they're made up of different atoms bound to each other. And so because of that binding, vitamins can be destroyed in the cooking process and in the transportation process. So heat, light, oxygen, like when you, if you cut something up or if you cut it out of the garden and leave it on the countertop, you've damaged the plant tissue, and the part that you damaged by cutting is now being exposed to oxygen. So we see some loss of vitamin content that way. And also alkalinity, so different acidic or basic environments can change the vitamin composition of our foods. So in a way, you could say that it's worth eating very fresh vegetables and fruits. Frozen is usually a good second choice. Certainly by the time we've got canned and like massively cooked vegetables and fruits, we've lost a fair amount of the vitamin content. So fresh and frozen would be my top two recommendations. And then minerals, similarly, I don't say much here. Just like with vitamins, minerals have myriad functions throughout the body. We certainly think of calcium and phosphorus in terms of bone strength and bone density. Minerals also act as something called cofactors for our enzymes. So they basically, many of the enzymes in our bodies require certain minerals to function. And if the mineral is not present, the enzyme won't work. So a lot of reactions in our bodies won't take place if there's a deficiency in the mineral that's required by that enzyme. We also have our electrolytes, magnesium, sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium. that function in fluid balance, so maintaining proper hydration, maintaining ample hydration inside and outside of the cells. Minerals are make up the structural form of a lot of our hormones, or they might be required to convert a hormone from its inactive form to its active form, so hormone activation. Our metabolic reactions again, and again, a lot of our digestive work requires minerals. Just like with our vitamins, growth and immune response also requires minerals to function. Different from vitamins, minerals are just individual atoms, individual elements, meaning they can't be broken down any further, and so they will not be changed during digestion or during cooking. So generally speaking, whatever the mineral content of a food is, that's going to be the mineral content when you eat it. One difference is if we, depending on how we cook something, so if we boil something, minerals can leach out of the food into the water. So we can lose mineral content that way, or if we bake something and the food kind of dries out, some of those minerals again might be lost in the water that comes out. And mineral content in a food is also really dependent on the mineral content of the soil. So if you're growing something, or if something is grown in nutrient poor soil, then the mineral content of that plant might not be very high. So we don't necessarily have a way of knowing this. We could kind of get into that organic and inorganic debate. And I think it's worth, if we're buying at big commercial stores, to buy organic products, because if it's a large-scale agricultural production, then you kind of want to safeguard. You'd kind of want to know that there were some sort of organic practices that were necessarily replenishing the soil year after year. If you're talking smaller scale farming, a lot of times the organic certification is expensive, and so small scale farmers don't really either have the financial means or aren't willing to afford the financial means to get the organic certification. So a lot of smaller scale farmers won't certify organic, although they may actually be practicing very organic, very restorative farming techniques. So if you shop at farmers markets, I always think it's worth just asking if you're comfortable. What are your practices? How do you tend to the soil? How do you replenish the soil? And or generally speaking, if you're buying from a small scale farmer, odds are they're doing a good job to tend to the soil nutrition. And same goes for our farm animals. The mineral content of their flesh is also going to be dependent on what they ate. There are roughly 20 different minerals, 20 to 30 different minerals that we require, not necessarily on a daily basis, but at least on an every other day basis. And they're pretty abundant in our food supply. Again, coming from whole, unprocessed foods. The more processed the food is, the less nutritious it is overall, and most likely the lower the mineral content and the lower the vitamin content. So mineral food sources being your fruits, your vegetables, beans and legumes, nuts and seeds, and then meats and shellfish for a select few. Revisiting water, but I don't see anything new here. I think I have more in the next slide. I do have another slide for water, maybe just after this one. So how much to eat? Just kind of going back through carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. For carbohydrate, the RDA is 130 grams, but the macronutrient distribution range would actually, for a 2,000 calorie diet, would be 225 to 325 grams per day. So I don't think I don't think we're doing it in this class, but there's a way, when we talked last week about calculating your estimated energy requirement, you can use that number, or basically when you calculate that number, you're calculating how many calories per day your body utilizes. I'll put a link in this week's content so you can kind of play around that if you want to. And once you know how many calories you need per day, then you can apply these mathematical conversions. So 45 to 65% of your total calories should come from carbohydrates. And again, choose complex sources like whole grains, beans and lentils, fruits and vegetables. For fats, the AMDR is 20 to 30%. There is no established RDA. As we said, there's a higher need for infants and newborns, infants, and children because of their development. With fats, it's critical to limit saturated fat intake to no more than 10% of total calories per day. Limit cholesterol to no more than 300 milligrams per day, if any at all. Again, cholesterol not a necessary nutrient. And then avoid or definitely minimize trans fats. And also include omega-3s, again, coming from nuts, seeds, and certain fish. For protein, the AMDR is 10 to 35%, and the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So for your average male, that calculates out to 56 grams per day. A lot of people are eating more than that in one meal. And for your average adult female, that's only 46 grams per day. And again, consider the protein package. So wanting to keep saturated fat and cholesterol low and keep fiber high. So in the protein world, that means selecting beans and lentils more often. For vitamins and minerals, each one has its own RDA, adequate intake or upper limit, tolerable upper limit. You might recall from last week, the servings per day. I think I added a serving here by saying at least 6 servings per day. The most recent recommendation is to have 8 to 12 servings per day combined fruits and vegetables. So, for the USDA to say 5 or 6 is kind of low. So I think 6 is a decent minimum, and I definitely encourage folks to have 8 to 12 where possible. A serving of fruit and vegetables is only a half cup. Eat a variety of foods overall. When we do eat a variety of foods, we generally ensure that we're getting a variety of our vitamins and minerals. There's this concept, eat the rainbow. Again, a lot of the different vitamins and different minerals impart color to the food. So if you're eating vitamins and minerals from the full rainbow spectrum, if you're eating foods from the full spectrum of the rainbow, you're kind of guaranteeing yourself that you're going to get a good variety of vitamins and minerals. Water, I think this is a really important one. The adequate intake for men is 3.7 liters per day, which is 125 ounces. Who's drinking that much? We all should be, well, for males. And 0.7 liters per day for women, and that's 91 ounces per day. This number increases if we're engaging in intense exercises for pregnant and lactating women. And worth knowing that roughly 20% of that total amount can come from your fruits and vegetables if you're consuming at least 6 servings per day. If you're not consuming any fruits and vegetables, then you're not getting any of your water from fruits and vegetables. And I think this is the last slide that I put in this lecture. So just revisiting the USDA's healthy eating plate. I made a little addendum on this one. Dairy should really be considered part of the protein group. It should not be a standalone group. And then the protein, again, just considering the sodium, the cholesterol, and the saturated fat content of your protein foods, and obviously minimizing those 3 nutrients. So if this is a half cup serving for these 2, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So yeah, this is actually recommending 9 servings a day, which is great. So more than the 6 that I said on the previous slide. And then again, down here, your nutrients to limit. I think I said this in the last lecture, but this is kind of an exorbitantly high number. It should really be more like 24 grams per day or less. Okay, that's it for this lecture.